And in a sense, the whole of Sufism is a commentary upon this. That is, we made a pact with God before we came to this world. And once we realize who we are in reality, we'll try to be that person really. Not to evade our inner reality by swimming in shadows and hiding ourselves in psychological closets and avoiding the truth of facing ourselves. So the book starts with that, and then it deals with that question of love, of knowledge, of beauty, of obedience to God, and finally how to realize the Sufi path. What does one do? Of course, Sufism in its authentic manner, like every spiritual path, is really oral, and its inner secrets are never written down. Much more so than, let's say, even texts of Hinduism, where there are a lot of books written on the actual techniques of Hindu practice and so forth. In the Islamic tradition, most of Sufism has remained oral in what comes down to the essential. But during the last few decades, whether fortunately or unfortunately, things which were always reserved for those who participated in the reality of Sufism have now become divulged in public. I remember when I was a young man, there was not a single picture of the Kaaba in the West. And can you imagine that? Now it's every day it comes out in some magazine or book. When it was first in 1964, when I was in Beirut, that Time magazine published and got permission to publish a 2-page picture of the Kaaba before Manhattan descended upon Mecca, of course, when these tall buildings had not been created. It was an incredible picture. I'm very critical of what is being done, that's why I made this joke. When 1964 appeared, I was in Beirut, it was like the ripple that went through the water because people were so amazed that that was that picture. In the old days, the rites of the Sufis were never seen by people outside. It wasn't like what we have today. And what they did was always kept oral. If you return to the traditional texts of Sufism, the great texts, some of them deal with ethics, akhlaq, in the spiritual sense. And most Sufi texts, what we call Sufi texts, deal with how to improve your character, how to be good. They deal with ethics, but not in a moralistic sense, in a spiritual sense. The great masterpieces, like Ihya Ulumuddin al-Ghazali, Yaqut al-Qulub, Risalah al-Sharia, all the great classical texts of Sufism, which were originally, except for the Kahf al-Mahjub, all in Arabic. Kahf al-Mahjub was in Persian. Later on, the proliferation of them. Really do not deal with what you do. It's only by allusion. And the same is true for other genres of Islamic writing, the hagiographies. That's another kind of Sufi writings. The lives of the great saints, starting the Hilyat al-Awliya of Abu Nu'aym Isfahani and building again up to our own times, deal with the lives of saints, but don't tell us exactly what practices they underwent, except by allusion. And the third great genre of Sufi writing, which deals with doctrine, metaphysics, books such as by Ibn Arabi and people like that, again, they do not deal with the actual practice of Sufism in a concrete way. They allude to it. And for example, in the writing of this, perhaps the greatest of all masters, Maulana, one of the greatest masters of Sufism, when you look, you have to know what you're looking for in order to find out what is really going on. You just take the Masnadi of the Divan Shams and read it. That's called beautiful poetry, very ecstatic. But how do you get there? How do you become Maulana? Maulana doesn't tell us because it was kept oral. And I have tried very hard to respect this privacy of the inner teachings of Sufism in this book. I've only divulged what can be spoken of in public, at least hoping to open doors for those who really want to take the practice of Sufism seriously. The Western mind and Muslims educated in the Western manner are used to seeing everything through its history. Nobody ever studies religion in college. You study the history of religions. Learn to study mysticism, you study the history of mysticism. The only thing which is studied in itself is science. mathematics, physics. You can, or if you like, to take a course in history of mathematics, but you don't have to. But in the other fields, they've become used to this historicism, which came out in the 19th century out of European philosophy, in which everything is reduced to its flow in time. There's temporal sequence. And so many important books have been written, some very good ones, like The Mystical Dimension of Islam by the late Anna Maria Schimmel, who was a very sympathetic German scholar of Sufism, especially in Maulana. She spent a long time in Turkey. She has written a beautiful book in German, and two books, I Am Wind, Your Fire, and Triumphal Sun, in English. She deals, to a large extent, with the history of Sufism. I try to break this habit of identifying the truth with this manifestation in time. And so in reversal to other books, what I deal with historically comes at the end, towards the end. And there I try to summarize the whole of the history of Sufism in one chapter, which of course is very impossible, but it is to bring out the salient features of it. And I did that especially for Western people, for them to realize that Sufism is rooted completely in the long Islamic tradition. That is a direct manifestation of the Quranic revelation, and has been there all over the centuries, from the very first generation of Muslims down to our own day. It's not a flaky modern invention. And to distinguish it from what I could say jokingly as California Sufism, which sort of invents Sufism out of thin air, pulling it out of the hat, the rabbit out of the hat, as if, you know, this was just something new invented for people living in Fresno, California, or something like that. I mention Fresno because there are a lot of people like that in that city. I try to show the fact that this is a deeply rooted tradition, like the rest of Islamic tradition, going back to the Quran. And then I concluded with something which has become somewhat controversial, perhaps, again for the first time, to try to give an understanding of that aspect of Sufism which has to do with Ma'rifah, with Irfan, that is what we call doctrinal Sufism, which appears upon the scene later in the history of Sufism in the 6th and 7th century. It really begins with Ghazali, but it finds its full flowering, the great Andalusian master, Muhammad Nasr. And this way of explaining Sufism, which is based on pure metaphysics and doctrine, then continued for the next 700-800 years. And Ibn Arabi is without doubt the most influential of all Muslim thinkers of the last 700 years, with the possible exception of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, with possible exception. Because Maulana, of course, was not well known in the Arab world. Whereas Ibn Arabi, of course, with all his writing in Arabic, was very well known in the Arab world as well as the non-Arab world. Maulana's greatest influence was among the Persians and the Turks and the Indian subcontinent and going all over to Southeast Asia. So perhaps Ibn Arabi is the most influential of all Islamic thinkers of the past few centuries. And much of the modern effort of both modernists and so-called reformers, whom I usually call reformers, is sort of puritanical reformers who try to destroy all of Islam by returning it to what they think is the pure Islam of the ancestors. Their whole process has been, in a sense, to destroy this doctrine of Sufism, because that provides an intellectual and philosophical foundation for thinking seriously Islamically, which many of us have